All right. Well, welcome to another episode. And I'm really excited because the topic that we are going to be talking about today, this is the first time we've ever talked about this on the Disrupting Divorce podcast. And I know that many of you that are listening are experiencing something or will experiencing something that will relate to our conversation today. So we are going to be talking about vocational assessments and the role that they play within the divorce space. And I'm really excited to have Dan Wolstein. He is the president of an organization on the East Coast, and the acronym is
KWVRS, Kincaid, Wolstein Vocational and Rehabilitation Services.
right.
It's a
We will,
mouthful.
Dan, we'll put your contact information in the show notes for everybody to check out. But I know that you often will do evaluations as a court expert. You are also the past president of the organization that kind of oversees, right, the vocational assessment. So just really excited to be able to have you on my show today.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
So let's just go ahead and kick off. One of the questions I often ask people is, what are you doing to disrupt the divorce space? And what I mean by that is, how are you working to make things better, raise the standard, just really disrupt things, but in a positive way?
Well, my piece of the pie or my slice is very, very specific. But I look at employability, the type of jobs that individuals can perform, either with or without training, and then reasonably expected earnings within those jobs. The way that I would say I'm changing the space, I hope to be changing the space. Some of the reports that I see out there are not as scientific. I like to think that the reports that I bring to matrimonial proceedings are very scientific and founded based on research, things that are very up to date with our data points. Some of the resources that we use within our reports are expensive. It's like paid access. So there's a paywall, and we pay into these resources that are very expensive so that we can provide a report that's more robust than others. So I like to think that the way that we're changing the space is by really improving the science behind employability and earning capacity in matrimonial proceedings.
I really appreciate that because I think this is one area that I have found myself, right, on behalf of my clients, pretty frustrated with over the last 11 years that I've been doing this work. And the reason is because I feel like vocational assessments originally were started to be able to help people understand, hey, if you were to go back to work, what could you be earning, right? And it was really intended to be fairly positive. And in fact, the organization that I worked for in higher education, I was an adjunct faculty, and they had an arm of the college that did just that. You could go in, you could meet with them. They would do different assessments and help you point you in the right direction of potential employability.
Right.
And now something that I saw as very positive now has become a little more challenging, and I think is often used by the other side to paint this picture that the person who maybe hasn't been as doesn't have as long of a work history is now all of a sudden able to make way more than what they maybe even historically have made. And so
Right.
when you and I met, I was really grateful that you are working in the direction of raising the standards, raising the bar as far as what is included in these reports. So let's talk a little bit about that. Because one of the things I know that you do is you encourage people to also be looking at Social Security statements. And I want to tell you that since you and I talked about that, I encouraged one of my clients to take her Social Security statement with her to the vocational assessment. And I feel like it's really helped me kind of like coach my clients to be prepared, to go into these situations where they're not open to hiring your services on the onset. They're going to have somebody local do it. And then we have an opportunity to potentially challenge that later. But all that to say, the assessor was like, wow, you're like the most prepared that of anybody that's come in here.
Right. It's factual data, right? These details are very important. It's hard to, if you're prepared and you bring that type of information to the evaluation. I've had people show up to their evaluations and they say, I've only earned 200,000 per year for my life. And then their spouse provides documentation. There was a gentleman and he was the breadwinner and he was earning up to 500,000, but he didn't provide that information. Actually, he was dishonest about it. So it's hard to say, well, it helps the evaluator clarify, right? These are concrete figures. And I think most experts try to triangulate their data sources, but this is one concrete area where, you really clarify the picture in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about that. From your perspective, what are some of the best practices and things that you feel like are areas where really, as a consumer, right, as somebody who's going to be engaged in the vocational assessment, that they may want to be looking for?
Well, I would say that in the court of law, I think we refer to these part of these cases as your theory of the case. What I would advise, not legal advice, but just from my point of view, documentation is very helpful at supporting opinions and supporting reports. So if your theory of the case is that you have certain obstacles, then I would say providing, if it's like a medical or a disabling condition, medical narratives can be helpful. If it's that you've never worked and you have a limited education, I would provide evidence of that limited education if possible. And so that helps the evaluator to get a clear understanding of the picture. If you have always worked part-time and you're looking into full-time or not, providing some material to the expert about what your commitments are every day. Oftentimes the court systems do look at full-time work, and even if a person decides not to work full-time because they have other commitments, it's kind of like a discussion. Ultimately it comes down to the judge, but these things can be summarized in a report too. So if you do have a lot of commitments, at the very least the triers of fact or the judge can take it into consideration when making a determination.
So, one of the things that I often hear that my clients say that the evaluation expert is suggesting that they bring is primarily a resume, history of, of their work, their educational background, et cetera. But that's kind of where it ends. And I love that you're saying the medical because I think one of the biggest challenges it is if we as the client, right, the patient don't provide that information, there's really no way for the vocational expert to get that information based on HIPAA related laws unless they went through the attorney. So, if we want to expedite that process and say, hey, listen, I do have some medical challenges and you can get evidence of that on your own, it's probably going to expedite,
Right. It
right?
is.
You being able to show, listen, I have some really challenging health issues and it does impact my ability to work full time or whatever it is. So I love
Mhm.
that. So the medical history, the educational history. I also like the fact that you said, hey, keeping a log or having some historical data on your responsibilities.
Right, because those can be summarized, organized, put into a table. I mean, there's different types of data sets. Education is one category, work history, a resume is very helpful. Your social security statement of earnings, that's another category. It's your historically demonstrated earnings. But then many people do have medical issues. I do personal injury cases too. And so some experts are very familiar with looking at these medical records. And sometimes you can even give your expert 1,000 different medical records and they'll come up with a chronology, which is something that we do. Or sometimes I'll just, like in these types of cases with matrimonial proceedings, I'll just review one medical narrative and it's called an independent medical evaluation. And a treating physician or a consulting physician may do an evaluation and render opinions regarding disabling conditions or an individual's ability to work part-time. They may have restrictions such as not working in public. They may need accommodations such as sitting and standing as needed. What I call it is a medical vocational scenario. It's kind of a hyphenated term, medical vocational, so that the medical doctor lays the foundation and then the vocational expert can address the implications regarding employability and earning capacity.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything else as it relates to those items?
With the medical issues, I think the longer the chronology, because some ailments are chronic illnesses. And so if you can show a trajectory or a medical progression, a medical narrative is helpful because the doctor can render restrictions or can also talk about your capacities. But, if there's a long-standing illness, showing the progression of that illness in terms of a medical chronology, like organizing dates of treatment, that may be something that your expert can do. And so it helps to provide foundation for expert opinions.
So I know we've talked about 3 or 4 kinda data points. Any other ones that you think are worth mentioning?
I would just say, I guess the last area is like future career goals. You could share that with your expert. There's what you've done in the past, but if you are considering taking training programs in the future or going back for some additional education, that can also influence the report as well.
So when you're putting together the report, are you looking at also like the timeline in which it would take somebody to get retooled? Because I'm thinking of a client who had been out of the workforce for, 20 years.
Hmm.
She originally had some kind of web design. Well, web design 20 years ago is like
Very different now.
very
Dif-
different. Okay.
Different languages.
Totally. The person who's doing the vocational assessment did their analysis, which basically included, in my opinion, a like Google search of jobs available. And it's like, listen, there's so much that's going to be imperative for her to be able to do that.
Hmm.
Is that part of the report as well? Because the problem with that is that they deliver that report and they say, hey, if she could make 60 grand or 100 grand or whatever the dollar amount is,
Hmm.
I don't feel like there's a lot of consideration on what it's gonna take to get we all know it's gonna take something, right? Time,
Right.
money, energy to get to that point, but nobody's actually articulating what it looks like. So they're assigning that value in the report right out of the gate
Right.
anytime.
So that discussion should be in the report, in my opinion. So the expert on such a case with maybe an individual is going back for schooling, there's a few things that I would do. One, I would talk about the length of time for part time versus full time. If it's part time, it may take 2 years. If it's full time, it may take 1 year. The cost of tuition is another consideration. And then the third thing is that if your expert uses a good wage database, they can summarize a table of starting wages and then progressions up to what can be established with some experience over time.
Yeah, I think that information would be really helpful. And for the vocational assessments that I have looked at, just kind of in reviewing information from my clients, I'm not seeing that, right? There seems to be a gap in how that information is presented. And I think there's an opportunity to do that better.
Right. It should be laid out. I agree with you that it should be organized within the report so that you can talk about the timeline for the individual to go through the training or the program. And then what is the individual going to come out? Uh, what are other individuals earning within the same space, entry level,
Yeah.
all of that can be discussed because even when you come out, there's still a wage range. Some people earn towards the 10th, 25th percentiles if they're still kind of building mastery of their
Yeah.
initial skill set. And then some people come out earning 50, 75 at the 90th percentile if they've achieved a little bit better mastery of the initial skill set. There's a wage range even when you enter the labor market in your first job. Mhm.
Absolutely. So let's switch gears a little bit. So if somebody's listening, and a lot of times the opposing counsel is requesting that they go through the vocational assessment, and so the client may not have an opportunity to select that person. The goal there is to be as prepared as they possibly can. We've talked about some of those things, showing up for it. But once they get the report back,
Okay.
what kinds of things might they be looking for? And what potentially might their options be once they receive that report? Because I think a lot of times people receive them and feel like, okay, well, this is an end all be all. And
Mhm.
this is what they said I should be making. And this is the number that we're working with. And I think people don't realize that there are some potential gaps that you could be looking for. And they could also hire their own expert to either review that report or do their own report. So can you talk a little bit about what you've seen there?
Sure. I spoke earlier on about all of the different reports that I see working in this space, and some of the opinions are a little bit kooky, So, yes, you can always get a second opinion. And oftentimes, given a report when I'm retained and they say, my client saw this evaluator and we think that the opinions are very far fetched. Would you review the analysis and report? Would you let us know? I may do some preliminary research. I may have a discussion about what the obstacles are, what the opportunities are, and, then I'll circle back. One case in particular, I remember I had done in my area, the tri-state area. They thought that a retired firefighter could be earning hundreds of thousands of dollars per year. And I said, that's absurd. So sometimes we see reports it's very easy to disagree with these reports. And I think I had gone through my methodology and had done a report on the same individual and come up with, that I thought would be reasonable for such an individual to earn. I can't remember right now, but maybe it was 75,000 per year as opposed to 250 or 300,000 per year. There can be very large gaps. When you go from evaluator to evaluator or expert to expert, there can be a significant difference between what they see in the individual being evaluated and what they think that that individual can earn.
It's interesting in a situation like that. I'm always kind of curious, like, what is it that they think this individual is going to be doing? Whether it's consulting or teaching, that's usually kind of that natural progression. If the individual has retired at, let's just say, 55, because they can retire what would be considered early and they still have opportunity to continue to work if they do. And that's usually like the normal progression. So I'm just kind of curious, what did they think that this individual is going to be able to do that was gonna generate so much more income for them?
A fire consultant, if I recall correctly. They thought that he could earn, 250, $300,000. But if I recall correctly, the position I took was this person has never worked as a fire consultant. So you need to establish a client base. You don't come in earning 300,000 per year. I know that they have to do reports, but that's very different from a very professional narrative,
Yes.
so has this person shown that they are a good writer, that they are capable of communicating advanced concepts in very simple prose? And if they haven't, then consulting is not going to be for them. So, in my opinion, the other expert took a very radical or very liberal opinion. I think I had very sufficient basis to disagree with it. And so, in response to what you were originally saying, just because an expert goes through their methodology and comes up with their opinion of what you're capable of earning, that doesn't mean that you have to accept it. They may have overlooked things. They may not have looked
Mhm.
at the robust, comprehensive analysis. They may not have given sufficient credence to your barriers. So there are all these things that I think getting a second opinion can often help clarify to the judge with a more comprehensive report.
Yeah, and absolutely, and it kind of along those lines, right? I remember working with a client who was an adjunct faculty, and she had her master's. She was making, just shy of 50 grand, and husband, soon to be ex, thought that he was working at Salesforce. He thought that she could be a drug rep and make over 100 grand a year. I'm like, "What?"
Mhm.
She could do this, she's got her master's, so, like, that's cool, right? Like, that's the reality of what happens, and they create this narrative that's, like, based on what? Like, I'm
Right.
so confused, right? And so, again, I wanna be able to empower my podcast listeners, my clients, to be able to show up to these conversations, being confident, knowing that, "Hey, listen, there are certain data points that should be looked at. You have
Mhm.
the opportunity to be able to, fine, participate in the vocational assessment because they're making you do it, but be prepared. And then
Right.
when you get the report, you have options. We don't have to just accept it because they created this report. You have options to ask questions, get a second opinion, etc. And I love that because I think, unfortunately, a lot of times the vocational assessments have been, hey, we did one, this is what it is, and it seems very black and white, and it's just not. So,
No, I remember one more complicated analysis I did where the individual was extremely intelligent and could have been $1 million per year earner. The husband was, but the issue, I did a bifurcated analysis in two different scenarios. One was being willing to relocate where the individual could earn over 1 million per year. And then one not relocating, and maybe it was a lower, like a 5 to 600,000 per year. The point is that it's not always black and white. There's different scenarios. And if you read over the report, oftentimes people have a very good understanding of their situation. And while they don't have the professional credentials to put it into the context that the expert does, simply relaying your thoughts to a new expert and saying, look, in my opinion, this subject was not covered. This scenario was not covered. The author, the expert, forgot to weigh this into their analysis. And so you can oftentimes people can give important information to the expert that allows for a more reasonable conclusion.
Yeah, absolutely. Gosh, we've covered a lot of ground in a short period of time. But what else is on your mind? What else do you want to make sure that my podcast listeners leave with that maybe we didn't already cover?
I'm kind of a more sensitive individual, so that kind of leads me more towards the personality side of things. So, in all of the times that I've done, I think that experts should be very respectful to the person that they're evaluating. And I think your listeners, to everyone listening to this podcast, I do think that also the way that you approach the session can really change too. I would be respectful to the interviewer. If the professional is doing his or her job right, then they're objective evaluators and they're relying on data points. But a lot of people are very hesitant and nervous getting into these sessions. I can't tell you how many times I've interviewed somebody and they said, "Oh, I was so scared before I met you." And I try to be reassuring and let people know that, I usually start off with the interview saying, "Look, I'm here to be respectful to you and I'm just here to get the answers to my questions." But I think as the interviewees, you can also kind of change the course of the session. If the person is hired by your spouse or your ex to be, it doesn't have to be a feisty evaluation. I find that people that are open and honest and respectful, those are oftentimes the people that I have the best interviews with and that really give me the clearest picture. So there's factual data and there's also the dynamics of the interview. So I
Yeah.
think if the person is hired by, again, your ex to be or your spouse, I would say just give room for it to be a respectful discourse and hopefully the opinions are reasonable.
And kind of along those lines, really quick. I mean, I think that a lot of times, particularly the women that I'm working with, right, there is a narrative, there is a story, there is something that led them to today. And I think there's also an aspect of them feeling like they want to be able to share like what they gave up or what they left at the table or, whatever. And I guess my question to you is I'm sure that some of that to some degree is relevant. And yet at the
Mhm,
same time, how does that weigh out? I mean, you're looking at facts, you're looking at the data points. Yes, there's an
mhm.
aspect of narrative, but help us get an understanding of how that kind of shakes out when it comes to report time.
Well, yeah, the narrative, the person's journey, and probably the progression of the marriage, how these things start out and they're wonderful and there's a lot of love, and sometimes they don't go in the direction that we think. I would say that, when people start to get into let's call it the place where things deteriorated, what he said, what she said, what he did, what she did, we're all human beings and emotions can run strong in matrimonial cases. And yet, even with a counseling background, I think that there's a place for that. In my interviews, I usually give respect and I give credence, so I'll apologize and I'll say, "I'm very sorry. It sounds like you've been through a lot." But the thing, I do try to redirect it because even if the person has been through a lot, certainly there's nothing that, in a 30-minute to an hour session, it's not the right place to process it. But I understand that it is important to process it. But it also is kind of outside the scope of an expert's evaluation because what we need to look at and evaluate are, again, scientific. What's the data? What's your education? All of these areas that things are important to talk about, but I don't think such content would be found in an expert report.
Yeah.
Mhm,
Yeah. And at the end of the day, to your point, right? I mean, it is fact based, and there are certain subsets of information that you're going to be looking for to be able to help generate that report. I guess that's an encouragement or kind of a nugget for those of you who may be going into these vocational assessment type conversations to say, as much as, I think we want to be able to plead our case, this isn't necessarily the place for that, right? In a sense
right.
of, you know what I mean? Like, yeah, but here's all the things I gave up. Let's talk, so the more that you can be prepared, meaning the client can be prepared to go in and have information and have it be, there's going to be some emotion with this because a lot of times it's, man, I could have had a great career,
Mhm.
right?
Right, absolutely.
We talked about it and I chose to go this direction. And there's a lot of that kind of So it is emotional, but I think if I can empower the people that are going into it to make the most out of the time, to be as prepared as they possibly can with what they need to bring so that the evaluation experts can do a great job, that's really where we want people to be.
Right. Data. It's all about data influences opinions.
Yep,
Mhm.
absolutely, absolutely, and so, yeah, if we can lean into that, that's really where, again, we're gonna be able to hopefully move the needle. So, this is awesome. I know one of the things that I am gonna want to have you back and talk about is, I know we do have some listeners who are like, "Yeah, Rhonda, but what about me? I'm the higher income earner," or "I have higher education. I have more education than myself. How do I best position it in that situation?" So looking
Mhm.
at it from a little bit of a different vantage point. So if those of you who are listening are like, "Yeah, but Rhonda, what about me?" Don't worry. We got you covered. I'll have Dan back and we
I'll be
will
happy to be
have a
back.
continued conversation about this. But I love this topic. I just want to thank you for the work that you're doing. I have been longing for best practices and elevating this space, and to be able to have found the work that you're doing is just amazing. I'm so excited
Well,
because
thank
it's
you.
long overdue.
Well, I appreciate that very much. I try my best to stick to the facts, and it's nice to feel like the work you do has value.
Yes, absolutely. So, well, thank you so much for your time today. Any final word of encouragement to our listeners as we wrap up?
Well, again, I said I'm sensitive. I care very much about the personal side of things. So, well, when you're going through these things, I hope that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. There are new chapters to begin, and hopefully, they're better chapters too. It's not always the easiest place to be, but you take a step at a time and hopefully get through it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Sure. Thank you for having me.